I thought moving into this neighborhood would bring peace, safety, and maybe even a few friendly barbecues. Instead, it turned into a battlefield I never saw coming. One day, I woke up to find threatening letters taped to my door, demands from people who claimed they had the authority to control every inch of my property. When Mark and his wife Sarah first bought their home, they thought they had found their forever place. It was a modest two-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of street where kids rode bikes after school and neighbors waved from their porches. After years of renting cramped apartments, they finally had a yard for their dog, a driveway of their own, and space to plant the small garden Sarah always dreamed about. To them, it felt like freedom. When Mark and his wife Sarah first bought their home, they thought they had found their forever place. It was a modest two-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of street where kids rode bikes after school and neighbors waved from their porches. After years of renting cramped apartments, they finally had a yard for their dog, a driveway of their own, and space to plant the small garden Sarah always dreamed about. To them, it felt like freedom. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors introduced themselves politely, the grass on every lawn looked evenly cut, and the streets stayed clean. It felt like the kind of community anyone would be proud to call home. But beneath that picture-perfect surface, there was something else. A set of unspoken rules and expectations that nobody mentioned during the open house tours. For Mark, weekends meant tinkering in the garage or grilling with friends. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, just a hard-working guy enjoying the life he earned. Sarah poured her energy into brightening their corner of the street. She planted sunflowers near the mailbox, hung a colorful wind chime by the porch, and even painted their front door a cheerful shade of blue. To them, it was a way to make their home truly theirs. But not everyone shared their vision of home. Some neighbors gave subtle glances at the flowers, others frowned at the chime that rang on breezy afternoons. One evening, after the couple returned from dinner, they found a folded flyer tucked under the doormat. It was the first official notice from the Homeowners Association. A polite reminder, it said, about maintaining community standards. At first, Sarah laughed. "It's just a flyer," she said, tossing it on the counter. Mark brushed it off too, but there was something unsettling about the wording. It didn't mention what standard they had violated. It was vague, almost like a warning whispered instead of spoken. Over the next few weeks, they started noticing things they hadn't paid attention to before. The same car circled the block each evening, slowing down in front of their house. A man with a clipboard paused at their fence one afternoon, scribbling notes before walking away. And then there were the neighbors, smiles that seemed just a little too forced, conversations that stopped the second Mark stepped outside. The couple tried to ignore it, focusing instead on their dream. But the tension was building, slowly, like a storm rolling in from the distance. They didn't know it yet, but what seemed like small warnings were just the beginning of a battle they never asked for. A battle that would test not only their patience, but also their rights, their reputation, and their peace of mind. Because in this community, it wasn't enough to pay your mortgage or mow your lawn. You had to play by the rules, rules that seemed to change without warning, enforced by people who thrived on control. And once you were on their radar, they never looked away. The first real sign that things weren't normal came in the form of a letter. Not tucked under the doormat this time, but delivered in a stark white envelope stamped with the HOA logo. When Mark tore it open, he expected some kind of either friendly neighborhood update, a barbecue invitation, maybe a newsletter. Instead, it was a fine, $100. The reason? Unauthorized alterations to exterior property. Mark stared at the paper in disbelief. The alteration was Sarah's sunflowers, 3 cheerful stalks swaying in the breeze near their mailbox. Apparently, those didn't fit the approved landscape design outlined in the HOA's bylaws, though nobody had ever mentioned what those approved plants were. At first, Mark tried to laugh it off. $100 for flowers? Who does that? But Sarah wasn't laughing. She felt attacked. Those flowers weren't just decoration. They were her way of settling into their new home, of making it personal and alive. Paying the fine felt like admitting guilt. Refusing to pay, though, carried the risk of something worse. So, Mark wrote an appeal. He worded it carefully, respectfully, explaining how small and harmless the flowers were, how they brightened the block. Weeks passed before he heard back. The response? A cold one-line rejection. Appeal denied. Fine stands. That was the first domino. Soon after, the letters came more frequently. Another envelope, this time for excessive noise. The noise in question? the soft chime Sarah had hung on the porch. The notice claimed it was disruptive to community tranquility. The fine? $200. Mark couldn't believe it. The chime was barely audible beyond their yard, but when he asked around, none of the neighbors admitted to complaining. "Must have been the board," one whispered, refusing to say more. It was becoming clear that someone, somewhere in the HOA, had a personal vendetta. The pressure ramped up. One morning, Mark stepped outside to find a bright orange notice taped to their garage. It declared that their trash cans had been left visible for too long after pickup, an infraction punishable by $50 per day. The irony: Mark had pulled them in less than an hour after the truck came by. Every new letter chipped away at their peace. Sarah began dreading the sound of the mailbox slamming shut. Mark started checking their property line daily, paranoid that someone was watching. And someone was. On more than one occasion, they spotted a board member slowly driving past, eyes fixed on their yard, clipboard balanced on the steering wheel. Then came the surveillance. At first, it was subtle, neighbors pausing too long near their fence, unfamiliar cars parked at odd angles down the block. But one evening, Mark noticed a tiny camera lens glinting from the bushes across the street. The HOA denied planting it, of course, but who else would bother? The fines piled up. What started as 100 here, 200 there, soon ballooned into thousands of dollars in supposed violations. Late fees stacked on top, along with warnings of potential liens against their property. The letters carried more aggressive wording now. Failure to comply will result in further legal action. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. The HOA was sending a message. We own you. This is our neighborhood. Step out of line and we'll bury you. Mark tried to fight back. He requested to see the HOA bylaws in full, only to be told they were internal documents, not available to residents without board approval. He asked to attend a board meeting, but when he arrived, the door was locked. Later, he got an email saying his presence was not required at this time. Every attempt to defend himself was met with a wall. Sarah grew restless. The guardman she tended with joy, sat neglected. She pulled down her wind chime, silenced the porch, and even considered repainting the blue door. "Maybe if we just blend in," she whispered one night, "they'll leave us alone." But Mark refused. This was their home. They had done nothing wrong, and he wasn't going to bow to a handful of poor, hungry neighbors with clipboards. Then came the breaking point. It was a Saturday morning when the knock rattled their front door. On the porch stood two uniformed men, not police, not city officials, but private security hired by the HOA. They claimed they were there to inspect the property for further violations. Sarah froze, terrified, while Mark's blood boiled. He demanded to see paperwork, a warrant, anything, but they had nothing. Just polo shirts with the HOA's logo and a smug sense of authority. Mark forced them off the property, but the message was clear. This wasn't going to stop. They were escalating beyond letters, beyond fines. They were trying to intimidate. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some whispered support, others avoided eye contact. One neighbor confided that the board president had called them troublemakers, warning others not to get too close. The isolation was crushing. Once friendly faces now turned cold. Invitations dried up. Even children were pulled away from Sarah when she waved hello. The couple's sanctuary had become a prison, and every day brought a new attack. Finally, Mark decided enough was enough. He started documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every strange car parked nearby. He took photos, kept logs, even spoke with an attorney. That's when he learned just how far the HOA could go. If the fines continued unpaid, they could place a lien on the house. In some states, HOAs had the power to foreclose on properties, stripping families of their homes over something as small as unapproved flowers or a misplaced trash bin. The thought chilled him. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a threat to everything they had worked for. But what the HOA didn't know was that Mark wasn't going to back down quietly. He had something they weren't expecting, something that would change the balance of power in a way they couldn't ignore. Because Mark wasn't just another homeowner. He was about to show them that the people they thought they could bully weren't so powerless after all. They thought they could fine us into silence, intimidate us into submise, see on. But what they didn't know, what they never even bothered to ask, was who I really was. And the moment they found out, everything changed. The breaking point came on a hot afternoon in July when the HOA called what they labeled a mandatory compliance meeting. The notice arrived in another cold white envelope, slipped into the mailbox without ceremony. The wording was blunt. Failure to appear would result in further legal escalation. Mark almost crumpled it in his hands. He'd endured months of fines, threats, and intimidation, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just another letter, it was a summons. When the evening came, he and Sarah walked to the clubhouse together. The air was thick with humidity, but the tension was worse. From blocks away, they could already see cars lining the street, neighbors gathering in clumps, whispering, staring. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a spectacle. Inside the clubhouse, the HOA board sat behind a long table, like judges in a courtroom. At the center was the president, a sharp-eyed man with a smug grin that seemed to stretch wider every time Mark looked at him. Stacks of papers were arranged in front of them, and a microphone stood ready. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," the president began, his voice echoing across the room, "you are here because of repeated violations against our community standards. Despite multiple warnings and fines, you have failed to comply. Tonight, this board will decide on the appropriate action moving forward." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some faces looked sympathetic. Others looked eager, like they were waiting for blood. The board began reading aloud a list of supposed violations: unauthorized flowers, unauthorized paint color, noise disturbances, trash can placement. Even Sarah's garden hose had made the list, accused of being visible from the street. Each accusation was followed in by the amount owed, the total climbing higher and higher until it reached over $10,000. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Mark clenched his fists. This wasn't a meeting, it was a public shaming. When the president finally paused, he leaned forward and delivered the threat Mark had known was coming. "Failure to resolve this balance will result in a lien placed on your property. Continued noncompliance could lead to foreclosure. That is within our rights as outlined in the bylaws." Gasps swept the room, a foreclosure over flowers and a wind chime. Mark felt the floor tilt beneath him, the weight of every injustice pressing down. This was the peak of their abuse, the board flexing its full power, daring him to resist. Each accusation was followed by the amount owed, the total climbing higher and higher until it reached over $10,000. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Mark clenched his fists. This wasn't a meeting, it was a public shaming. When the president finally paused, he leaned forward and delivered the threat Mark had known was coming. "Failure to resolve this balance will result in a lien placed on your property. Continued noncompliance could lead to foreclosure. That is within our rights as outlined in the bylaws." Gasps swept the room, a foreclosure over flowers and a wind chime. Mark felt the floor tilt beneath him, the weight of every injustice pressing down. This was the peak of their abuse, the board flexing its full power, daring him to resist. But what they didn't know was that Mark had come prepared. He stood, pulling a thick binder from under his arm. Calmly, deliberately, he set it on the podium and flipped it open. Inside was every letter, every notice, every fine, photocopied and time-stamped. He had photographs of their house, video clips of their yard, and even sworn statements from the few neighbors brave enough to speak. But that wasn't all. Mark cleared his throat and addressed the room. "I've spent the last 2 months documenting every single move this board has made, every fine, every denial, every intimidation tactic. I've cross-referenced your notices against the state's HOA statutes, and I've found multiple violations of my rights as a homeowner." The room went silent. The president's smirk faltered. Mark continued, his voice steady but sharp. "You've issued fines without evidence. You've denied me access to the bylaws, which is illegal under state law. You've attempted unauthorized property inspections and hired unlicensed security officers to intimidate my family. And now you've threatened foreclosure over trumped-up charges that wouldn't hold up for a single second in court." He paused, letting the words sink in. Every eye in the room was on him. "And here's the part you didn't count on," he said, leaning closer. "I am a United States Marshal, which means I know the law a lot better than you think I do. And I can assure you, what you've done here doesn't just violate HOA bylaws. It borders on harassment, intimidation, and in some cases, fraud." The room erupted. gasps, whispers, even a few cheers from the back row. Sarah's hand gripped his, her eyes wide with pride. The president sputtered, trying to regain control. This is irrelevant. We are within our rights. Mark cut him off. No, you're not. I've already filed a complaint with the state attorney general's office. I've contacted Cal news stations, who are very interested in a story about homeowners being bullied out of their property. And if you think for 1 second you can put a lien on my house without me fighting back with every legal tool at my disposal, you're welcome to try. He slammed the binder shut. But I promise you, it will be the last mistake you ever make as a board. The room exploded again, this time louder. People stood up, shouting questions, some demanding resignations. The president's face turned crimson, his papers shaking in his hands. One board member quietly slipped out the side door, unwilling to be part of the fallout. Sarah wiped her tears, her fear replaced with something stronger: vindication. For the first time in months, the balance of power had shifted. The HOA wasn't in control anymore. Mark was. The board scrambled to regain order, banging the table, threatening to adjourn. But the damage was already done. The neighbors had seen everything. They had watched the HOA humiliate a family over petty rules, only to be exposed in front of everyone. Mark turned to leave, Sarah beside him, their heads high. As they stepped out into the night, the whispers followed them, not of fear or pity, but of respect. Some neighbors even clapped. But the war wasn't over. The board might have been shaken, but they weren't finished. Mark knew they would regroup, strategize, and come at him again. This was only the turning point, the moment when the hunted became the hunter, when the quiet homeowner revealed he wasn't so powerless after all. And as Mark walked back toward his house, binder in hand, he couldn't help but think, they wanted a fight. Now, they've got one. They thought the climax of this battle would be my downfall, but in truth, it was theirs. What happened next didn't just change the course of this neighborhood, it changed the way everyone looked at the HOA forever. The days after the explosive HOA meeting were unlike anything Mark and Sarah had experienced since moving into the neighborhood. For the first time in months, there was silence. No new envelopes appeared in their mailbox, no security cars idled by their curb, no strangers circled the block with clipboards. It was as if the board had been stunned into retreat. But silence doesn't always mean peace. Mark knew this wasn't over. HOA boards don't crumble overnight, especially ones that thrive on control. They regroup, whisper in private, and look for ways to strike back. That's why he wasted no time. Within 48 hours of the meeting, he contacted his attorney and filed a formal harassment complaint against the HOA. Attached to the complaint was his meticulously documented binder, hundreds of pages of fines, notices, photos, and dates. Each entry was another nail in the coffin of the board's credibility. The Attorney General's office acknowledged the complaint within a week. Local news picked up the story soon after, drawn to the shocking headline, HOA threatens foreclosure over flowers. Reporters showed up on the street, cameras rolling, as they interviewed neighbors who admitted they'd been too afraid to speak out before. One by one, stories emerged, accounts of petty fines, intimidating letters, and rules that seemed designed not to protect the neighborhood, but to punish anyone who stepped out of line. The board's carefully crafted image of authority began to crumble. For Sarah, it was vindication. She had once feared even stepping onto her porch, but now she stood in front of cameras, holding her sunflowers high and declaring, "This is my home, this is my life, and no board has the right to bully families out of their own property." Her words struck a chord far beyond their street. Within days, the segment aired statewide, flooding social media with comments. P.O. Plea, who had battled their own HOAs, shared their anger, their solidarity, and their own war stories. Mark's fight had sparked something bigger. Inside the neighborhood, the impact was immediate. Neighbors who once looked away now knocked on the Carter's door with casseroles, words of support, and their own files of HOA letters. One family admitted they'd been fined for leaving their kids' bikes in the driveway. Another showed Mark photos of warning letters for having non-uniform holiday decorations. It wasn't just the Carters, it was nearly everyone. The difference was, Mark had the courage to fight back. And fight back he did. The legal process was slow, but relentless. The Attorney General's office launched an inquiry into the HOA's practices. Several board members were subpoenaed, their emails requested, their financial records reviewed. What investigators found shocked even Mark. Hidden fees had been siphoned into private accounts. Rules had been enforced selectively, ignored for friends of the board, weaponized against those they disliked. Fines weren't just arbitrary. They were part of a larger scheme of intimidation and profit. The fallout was swift. The board president, the man who had sneered at Mark during the meeting, resigned under pressure. 2 other board members followed, citing personal reasons. The remaining members scrambled to distance themselves, claiming ignorance, but it was too late. The HOA's reputation was shattered. For the Carters, the relief was immense. All their fines were voided, every charge rescinded. The threat of foreclosure vanished. Their garden was restored, their chime rehung, their blue door left exactly as it was. But the real victory wasn't in the flowers or the money. It was in reclaiming their dignity, their right to live without fear in the home they had built together. Yet the impact reached far beyond their fence line. The story went viral, sparking debates across the country about the unchecked power of HOAs. Legislators began fielding calls from angry constituents demanding reform. Some states even introduced bills aimed at curbing HOA overreach, requiring transparency, limiting fines, and giving homeowners more rights to challenge boards. Mark hadn't set out to become a symbol. He just wanted peace for his family, but by standing up, he had exposed a system that thrived on silence. And once silence was broken, there was no going back. As for the neighborhood itself, change was slow but real. With the old board dismantled, a new election was held. For the first time, ordinary homeowners, teachers, parents, retirees, ran for positions. People who cared about keeping the streets clean, yes, but also about respecting the lives behind each front door. The culture shifted from control to community. Potlucks replaced complaints. Conversations replaced threats. Sarah noticed the difference first. Neighbors who once avoided her now stopped to admire her sunflowers. Children waved from bikes again. The invisible wall of fear had lifted. Mark felt it too, the con. Stant tension in his chest eased. He no longer dreaded the sound of the mailbox. He no longer scanned the street for watchers. Their home finally felt like a home. Still, he never forgot the lesson. Late one evening, sitting on the porch with Sarah, he reflected on everything they had endured. The sleepless nights, the letters, the humiliation, and the triumph that came when they refused to bow. He realized that the fight was never just about flowers or a wind chime. It was about power, about ordinary people being pushed to their breaking point by those who believed rules mattered more than humanity. And it was about what happens when someone finally says, enough. For viewers, the story carried a message far beyond one cul-de-sac. It was a reminder that bullies, whether they wear a uniform, sit behind a desk, or hide behind bylaws, thrive only when people stay quiet. That fighting back is never easy, but it's always necessary when your home, your dignity, and your peace are on the line. As Mark put it in one final interview, they wanted us to feel small. They wanted us to think we didn't matter. But the truth is, the only power they ever had was the power we gave them. And the day we took that power back, everything changed. The Carters' story ended not with defeat, but with victory. A victory that echoed in the lives of their neighbors, in the laws of their state, and in the voices of thousands of people across the country who had finally found the courage to share their own battles. And for anyone listening, one question remains, one that lingers long after the screen fades to black. If this happened to you, would you fight back?